You all for joining us for Pando Days. My name is Eugene Shirley, and I'm the president of Pando Populous. We're an environmental and social impact accelerator based in Los Angeles County. Pando Days brings the art, design, architecture, and sustainability programs together from 10 Southland colleges and universities to help LA County implement its ambitious new sustainability plan. Each of the participating Pando Days institutions adopted a different goal from the county's plan and created ingenious plans of their own for implementing it. Brainstorming began in the fall of last year with project development over as many as 7 months. Make sure you go to our website, pandopopulous.com, to see all of the school project descriptions and read through their presentation materials. All 10 of the premier events follow the same format. Hosted by a member of the Pando Board of Directors with a summary presentation of the featured project by the team lead. Short responses and questions then follow from members of the Chief Sustainability Officer Task Force for LA County, followed in turn by a period of public Q&A. We'll close by the end of the hour. All projects are being assessed by a panel of judges based on recordings of these presentations and supporting materials. When we come together on July 25 for the finale, we'll hear which projects they believe have the greatest chance for the greatest impact for county sustainability. The Pando Days host for today is Vickery Murphy. Vickery is district representative for Senator Anthony Portantino. Pre-politics, she worked at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, where she is on the flight team for the Galileo mission to Jupiter. She designed the launch sequence for the Cassini mission to Saturn. With her training as an engineer, you can see why we thought she'd be an excellent fit for hosting today's premier event. Vickery, thank you very much, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Eugene. It's really great to be here today for this really interesting, fascinating project. Today's project is put together by Woodbury University, and it's on saltwater gardens, and the subtitle, Innovations for the Twin Threats of Underground Saltwater Incursion and Food Scarcity. This project addresses the Los Angeles County goal number 2, buildings and infrastructure that support human health and resilience. The project envisions an alternative approach to combating both the effects of rising seawater and the increase of aridity in our cities. As sea levels rise, a less visible yet destructive invasion of saltwater into our aquifers is taking place beneath cities and agricultural regions. In response, the project proposes to redirect this incursion and turn it into a boon. This is particularly important because the main goal for water issues is to be able to use as much of your local aquifers as possible, because the primary cost of water is moving the water from Northern California or from the Colorado River over to your local communities. And because water's heavy and it takes a lot of electricity to lift it up over our many mountains. So the cleaner we can keep our aquifers or make our aquifers, the more access we have to local water. And let's see, so I would now like to introduce the professor for this very fascinating project and the team lead, Professor Berenica Boburska.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll just, as an introduction, say that at Woodbury we have been working together with the group of students under the guise of the Hinterlands Institute, which is a collection of degree project and master studios of architecture and also topic studios, expeditions to the hinterlands and exhibitions. So it's like a laboratory, a design laboratory with a collection of students. We've been actually brewing or kind of kindling some of the ideas that sort of synthesized in this project. But I have to thank Pando for letting us start a fire, one fire at the end of this, and it does feel like a beginning. So maybe I can start sharing my slides now. So yes, this is the Hinterlands Institute logo, and the title is Saltwater Gardens, but as any kind of simple idea, I think it is a synthesis of many many things. So the kind of the complexity of the goals that the city has taken on perhaps can come together in something quite simple. Goal 2 is our goal, the buildings and infrastructure, but really it connects to others as well, as you will see. And yes, it is an infrastructure for a new kind of public space and a new kind of commons in the city and the new kind of nature that we're inviting into the city. As you've heard, the project envisions an alternative approach to responding to dual threats that the world faces, and we are fast becoming one of the arid regions which are expanding. And so nature responds to the rising seawaters and to the aridity of the climate because of climate change. And so these are effects on landscapes, but what are the effects on cities? So one very obvious effect is the sea rise, heat island effect. But certain things are already happening. And so this is, for example, the amount of seawater incursion underneath Los Angeles. So salt water invades the aquifers beneath our city. So the project in a nutshell aims to not necessarily fight it in a kind of a engineering way, but to sort of divert the flow. So redirect this intrusion or tap into it and soak it up onto and make it part of the city, so that a new saltwater infrastructure would support lush gardens, pioneer saline forests, and other such public spaces that embrace these new salty conditions and botanies. So this is already this has already happened. This invasion underneath Los Angeles, and as you can see on this map, the aquifer, the green zone, has all these water wells that we need, which are threatened by the kind of the incursion that is going in from all sides. And the seawalls of Los Angeles that protect the groundwater basins are basically hundreds of injection wells that inject fresh water, very precious fresh water into the ground to create a kind of a pressure that pushes back the sea. So, so this is the existing solution since the 50s, and we think it won't work indefinitely. It is because of the severity of the climate change and the changes that are happening faster. This solution will not last forever to protect the basin. So on the larger urban scale, the project, the Saltwater Gardens, will straddle the boundary of the seawater intrusion beneath the city. It's about 2 miles in, and sometimes even 3.5 miles in. And so the existing solution, a seawall, will not hold much longer. So the Saltwater Gardens, as a figure, might make a kind of a necklace of much needed public spaces and protect the basin. So we thought of 3 prototypes that are varying in scale, perhaps, and sort of a strategy of siting in this landscape. So these 3 prototypes are the invasive forest, and I'll talk about why it's invasive, Saltwater Garden, and Saline Pivot Park. And these are geared towards different conditions. One of them is small enough to be a pilot project, so I'll talk about that in a bit more detail. So first project, the Forest of Torrance. So forests, is there space for a forest in Los Angeles, in a city? like ours. We are used to street trees being called by that name, a dispersed urban forest. But what of the actual space of the forest? Its characteristic darkness and density, mystery, mythologies, fairy tales, and qualities that we think of as opposite to the city. And yet they are the ones that we might increasingly need: darkness, coolness, shade, humidity. So can the forest return to the city in its strong form, not in a sort of dispersed form, and in a clever way provide a technology which can solve environmental urgency? So in searching for a site for this forest, we decided to look at the most dramatic kind of failure of the current technological solution, let's say, of the seawall. This is where the salt plume has breached the seawall, and you can see it basically occurring in below, on the east side of the seawall, below LAX. Torrance. Torrance is the sort of the central boulevard running through it. And this we did by superimposition of different sources. Trying to find exact maps of this plume is difficult. And so we want to sort of work closer to with hydrogeologists in the future to be a bit more exact. But Torrance Boulevard is a kind of a typical LA landscape of, and a fast becoming obsolete landscape of big box retail. And there's lots of car parks, and there's also one sort of iconic abandoned Hawthorne Plaza Mall full of sort of dystopian imagery there. It's gigantic, but there's lots of other ones. And they are on the way out as one kind of traverses Hawthorne Boulevard. It's definitely something that is becoming, that is changing. There's no longer perhaps needed as much, these big box retail warehouses. So, but they're somewhat iconic. So I wonder if, you know, we can think of a way of misusing them or reusing them. So the Forest of Torrance maybe have found a new foothold along Hawthorne Boulevard, sprawling big box retail stores, fast becoming obsolete in the densifying city, can now perhaps live on through this adaptive reuse. So what if we can imagine tapping into the 3-mile saline plume below, a saltwater incursion which breached the defensive wall? What if a captive saltwater swamp forest flourishes within the mall perimeter walls, an urban swamp surrounded by public ramparts and exploratory paths? So as an example, we don't have a specific site, but these are very, very archetypal boxes. And so we sort of went through a scenario of undressing a box, sort of like a controlled unbuilding of this typology, and then using the perimeter wall in a sort of almost like preserving it, but building a thickened promenade for the forest, and then sculpting the ground within the box in order to receive the flood of the brackish waters or the salty waters from below. So this is the first stage, sculpting the swale, the forest as something that receives water. The first, you can't instantly grow a forest. Saltwater marsh might be first. Instruments to measure salinity and such things later become meadows with shrubs and flowers, small trees, a nursery for the forest in a way, the meadow, and then finally a mature swamp forest, as in a forest that is partially flooded. So this is roughly the kind of the gist of it, the vision. And it is a walled forest, so there's a sort of a mystery when you walk on Hawthorne Boulevard to see just tips of trees. And it's a kind of a pioneer forest and an invasive forest, in a sense, you know, kind of reversing the power hierarchy. The city usually invades landscapes and forests, but now the forests return. to Hawthorne, to Torrance. And so these are visionary images. But I want to talk about specifics because it means there's a completely new botany involved, and plants that can thrive in salt water are called halophytes, and these are the ones I want to just briefly introduce. Some of them excrete salt, some of them absorb salt, some of them keep the salt in the gland. So this is a beautiful quinoa flower. Quinoa is a halophyte, not many people know, and it keeps the salt in its glands. And so true halophytes are the ones that thrive in salt water as much as salinity as the sea, or even some of them, as we will hear, as much as desalination brine, so really, really salty. And they're very hardy plants. They kind of become pioneer species because they take foot in landscapes that no other plants can grow. They are the hope of kind of the future crop production because of that, but they're also ancient. So I'll talk about that in a minute. So looking at the three zones, three zones that make up this forest in time, but in layers, in vertical layers, we kind of very quickly put together, and this requires much more study, plants that can survive in salt water. And there's, the salt marsh, the wet meadow, and the swamp forest with trees. Salt cedar is one that we probably know, mangroves and other things. So the meadow becomes the most kind of lush place that could be foraged for vegetables, for salads, and for Saliconia. It's also full of halophilic flowers. So these three environments would go in together to form a forest. A forest is a collection of sort of layers. It's not sort of uniform. In a sense, one of the precedents is the Miyawaki mini forests that are now quite successfully establishing themselves. They grow very, very fast because there's a density, and I think that's one of the characteristics of a forest. Lots of species, density, and all the saplings growing together. It's a little bit like looking at the Pando root system. The forest, because of the roots intermingling, is much healthier and you can grow without pesticides. So these are existing forest trials, and within a year you have a lush place. So these are kind of let's say precedents for this. But in December, I before the lockdown managed to still make a trip to the Middle East and visited the Mazda Institute and Center for Biosaline Studies. And this is a mangrove forest that's a couple of years old, and it's in the middle of the desert. So it's possible to grow certain species away from the sea as long as you supply them with salt water, which is something that we are saying that we can tap into. Saliconia fields. So this is grown actually in desalination brine. That's incredible. I mean, that's saltier than the sea. So Saliconia as a plant is a kind of a hero in our project because it can do that. It can also be eaten. It's a delicacy in certain countries, samphire, salads and things. It's also it's also so rich in volatile oils that they've managed to make a biojet fuel and actually flew a flight from Abu Dhabi to Europe on it. so this is what the guys are showing me there in the Mazda Institute. So after all that, we decided to make an emblem for Saliconia because it's such a plant that supposedly might save us. But there are others. There are others. This is sort of the future, but there's also ancient plants like quinoa. 7,000 years ago, it was cultivated in Peru, and it is a halophyte. So plants and knowledge that is forgotten sometimes because we've started to make agriculture in a specific way. We've forgotten the kind of the hardier plants, but they're also beautiful. So that's also part of the project, that it's an experiential garden forest. food forest. It's beautiful as well. We're looking at colors. If you don't harvest Saliconia, it sort of fires up into these amazing autumn colors. And there are other species in the meadows, in the lower kind of understories, sea kale, sea spinach, sea beet, lots of delicious salads. So embracing the saltwater diet of the future is one of the functions of the forest and the gardens. So Halophilic Kitchen Lab might be a place that might happen in one of the structures surrounding the forest. So tastings, demonstrations, foraging, mini expeditions. It's a mini forest and you can have an expedition into it. So being inventive about, that's a Saliconia smoothie. I've eaten, it's quite a nice salad. It's quite salty to the taste, of course. So you just have to add oil and lemon. So the beauty of overlooked marsh plants and plants that thrive in salt water. These are all the species. One surprising one that I didn't know about is the ancestor of the sunflower that we have, Helianthus paradoxus. Paradoxus because it used to grow only on the edges of salt lakes. And there's some non-native species that I think we should invite into our forests. Sea hibiscus, a beautiful flowering plant in swamplands of other regions. But I think that there's a kind of a discussion about, we can talk about that later, about native and non-native and how nature adapts and migrates. We might have to help trees migrate a bit. So surface runoff patterns, as every forest is a swale, sometimes seasonal rainwater will be absorbed into the forest. So this is from the suburbia and also from the adjacent parking lots. So swales exist in Torrance, but they are kind of engineered like this. And this is a spontaneous marsh in Torrance, in a swale that is inaccessible. But there's also the Madrona Marsh Preserve, vernal pools, which are just adjacent to Target behind the big malls. So we want to also contact the Marsh organization for botanical know-how. So who are the new foresters? Citizen scientists or botanists? What are their instruments, outfits, traditions, folklores? They take care of the collective forest, the commons, the new commons, and the shared resource, the shared aquifer. So these things radically change our attitudes towards aquifers, the kind of caring for them. It's not an invisible thing. So Saltwater Gardens is the next sort of more detailed prototype. And we're proposing a necklace of saltwater parks and gardens along the sea wall. So like gardens threaded onto the thread of the wall. So a series of gardens along the West Coast Basin, 15-kilometer long line of injection wells, 153 of them. So we'll be reversing the old strategy of injecting precious fresh water to hold back the sea. So the existing wells would pump up the seawater to soak up in the humid gardens and spongy marsh enclosures. So the saltwater infrastructure becomes spatial and public here. We can see sort of all along the seawall parks that can be threaded, leftover spaces where we've tracked down the locations of the wells, and they are very, very invisible. They have a number. I mean, it's nothing kind of spatial or pronounced. So this invisibility is part of the problem, I think, of attitudes towards water and aquifers. So well-dressing traditions are the opposite, right? So we've researched spatial water infrastructure in arid climates like the Falaise system and the walled gardens as inspiration. And these are some of the initial design sketches, channeling water from the well and spilling it to make gardens, and what kind of different spillages one can make. And the first model was made of felt to sort of sculpt these water walls and gardens. And this is the diagram of it spreading the water from the aquifer, not from the aquifer, from the salt intrusion. So this is the opposite of that. It orchestrates lush meadows and gardens. This wall that spreads the water, and there's on top of the channels, the timber structure is assembled to create shady places. So you can see sort of the reference to the fallage system, but also to Italian gardens with kind of tables as something that channels water, perhaps. So a bench, a table, a stair. So these water channels would become the public public infrastructure as well, not just water. So this is some development, some experimental kind of spillage paintings and visuals of the garden. And the walls also, you know, Hitisha has developed this amazing system, which is very delicate, but actually is sort of a technological marvel, I think, that as an assembly of elements that comes together to form a complexity, and brine misters are threaded through. So, as the brine trickles down the walls, it becomes a cooling wall. It's a kind of an ancient refrigeration, low-tech technology, but it also creates the salt ornament on these members. So we've in some of the past studios, we went on field trips to salt lakes and looked at how salt creates these amazing kind of almost decorative ornaments. And can we create a new ornament through perhaps even CNC milling? Not only the joinery, but the way to sort of entice salt growth. So that was our kind of smallest prototype. But we wanted just to say that aquifers don't stop in the city. So Oxnard, in Oxnard, you know, the incursions are going dramatically into the farmlands. And so there's another kind of idea was to continue the strategy of making a necklace of saltwater parks, but this time using the off-the-shelf farming water irrigation system to create a public park in a farming field community. So, you know, taking something that is like a typical water irrigation system and creating a very different landscape. So, it's a sort of a similar thing, but then drawing these bands of colorful halophytes, colorful botanies, like the purple flowers and the yellow flowers. So that's just a kind of an ending. Anyway, so thank you very much. Maybe I went over the time a little bit, but that was our presentation. And we have some, I mean, I can stop sharing maybe now, if I can find it. So we have some next steps, but maybe we can talk about that during the discussion. We want to create a prototype structure using sort of the resources at Woodbury to fabricate this structure, to figure out the systems. But we're also looking for project partners. Because obviously, depending on the public site that we choose, there's a specificity and the locality and the use that might come out of it. So yes, I can discuss that a little bit later.
Berenica, thank you so much. That was really fascinating. I really loved hearing what you guys are coming up with, these creative ideas. And today we are really lucky to have with us 4 members of the Chief Sustainability Officer Strategic Task Force for LA County, who are going to be offering short assessments of your project and asking 1 or 2 questions each. And after the CSOs have responded, we're going to open up for Q&A for public questions. Now, first up today is Mark Spears, who is the founding CSO of Disney, who's now retired, and is a founding member of the CSO task force. Take it away, Mark.
Vickery, thank you. Thank you very much. And Professor Berenica, you and your team, and certainly the advisors are to be applauded. This is an extraordinary project. I mean, comprehensive, innovative. I'd say it's probably the most technical project or proposal we've seen thus far. And I think two other things that are fascinating about it is really elevating a situation or a condition in our county that I would say most of us, me included, are not aware of, but certainly vital to address. I think the other thing is the fascinating redeployment or reuse of existing resources that are integrated into your project. So we really look forward to seeing this materialize. Let me ask a couple of questions together, and for the sake of time, under really a common theme of intentionality, both of design and of impact. The first one has to do with perhaps the nuance. You described the current injection system and I guess the current efforts to hold back the seawater as a curtain, and yet your design talks about necklace. So I think the question for me there is, does that recognize the inevitability of a need for permeability and over time the ongoing advancement, intrusion of the saltwater? The second part is the integration of the saltwater tolerant plants that you spoke of. How do those interact, or are they expected to interact with the existing ecosystem, the flora and fauna there? Ultimately, do you see those replacing it over time if and when seawater continues its intrusive march? And perhaps last but not least, it seems as though the intent of the current freshwater wall is more of what I'd call a push strategy. It's pushing the seawater back or holding it back, whereas the design you all have on the table seems to be more of a pull, recognizing the inevitability and existence of seawater and pulling it to the surface or throughout the design of your project for application. And is the design contemplate that the intrusion, the continuing intrusion, is inevitable and therefore it accommodates it? If you could just touch on a couple of those in any way, shape, or form you'd like.
Okay, well, thank you for those questions. Yes, the wall strategy is a wall strategy. It doesn't let anything through. It's a kind of a reaction against an animal that's too big. I mean, the oceans are rising and they will rise much more. So this is a temporary measure, and but we can already use the infrastructure in place to sort of to do another strategy like what we're proposing, which is to soak it up, to invite it into the city, to use it as a resource, use it to create a new botany for the city. Now, of course, this is ongoing. We can be pessimists or optimists, but I think there will be a band. There will be a kind of a zone in the city, in many coastal cities, which will have to renegotiate with the oceans and the seas. And we can do it in a kind of a creative way, or we can do it in a kind of this is very old school engineering in a sense, but there are new solutions now, I think, coming out of, engineering solutions that talk about more subtle channel systems and things like that. I mean, so New Orleans is an example of that, where, certain measures are working against the landscape, but we want to work with the landscape. So flora, it's a good point. This is sort of, that's why I called it, I mean, it's a little bit of a provocation calling it an invasive forest. In some way, it's a migratory forest. Plants also migrate, as people do and as animals do, because of climate change. They just move much slower. And some of their habitats are disconnected. Swamps don't talk to each other. We've put cities in between these paths of plant migrations. And So maybe we have to kind of think differently now with the nature that we invite. Saltwater plants, especially marsh plants, don't grow in an arid condition. So in some way, the kind of the environment keeps them there, makes them flourish there. So I think there isn't a kind of a danger of a mangrove invading, you know, kind of Century City Boulevard or something. There is a kind of a condition that I think these are like sort of little islands, little pockets of lushness, and there will be, we imagine, it starts with a necklace, but I think it ends up being a zone, much more interweaving with the city. So it's an overlay on that part of the city, perhaps more than a singular thing, but as a kind of a maybe also remembering the tradition of the Olmsted brothers landscape plans for the emerald necklace. The emerald necklace was a plan that they envisioned, which connected, I think, the mountains to the ocean. There's a kind of a connectivity that I think is the first step, and then later it becomes more of a zone. If that was.
It was. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hey, Mark, those were great questions. Thanks so much. I'd now like to introduce the next CSO, Luis Navarro, with Langen Engineering and Environmental Services.
Great, thank you. And Professor Berenica, let me congratulate you on the work you're doing on what really is a topic that is of some urgency from a sustainability perspective, and it doesn't get the attention that it deserves. Climate change has gotten a lot of attention, but when you look at the effects of climate change, the risks are all about the movement of water and fluids. And sometimes groundwater doesn't get the same attention, but when you consider the importance of having fresh groundwater and aquifers that are capable of providing drinking water to a community, you see the importance of the work you're doing here. So let me start off congratulating you with that. And as a hydrogeologist, I love the nature of the study and understand what you're trying to do and consume some of the salt water that has gone under and replaced the aquifer, and by consuming some of it, lowering the levels, and that allows the fresh water to continue to get back towards its natural course. So I really do like that. And a couple of questions first, and then a couple of ideas to follow up on this work. So first off, is there analysis of the species that you're proposing and seeing which ones are native or may have been native to Southern California versus those that would be introduced initially? I think as you'll find, to implement this and some of the permits and requirements that will be needed, native species are going to be something that's going to be a lot more accessible and permitted. So that's an interesting and an important point. And if they are invasive, or if they're foreign, are they invasive? And will they grow, and will they, how do they interact with native species? Can these forests grow beyond the footprint that we have and start to take over other areas that maybe have native species there? So that's going to be an important aspect to see how they interact. And then in conditions with the soil, I am going to assume that some of these species have an optimal salt level within the fluids and within the soil structure that allows them to grow. Over time, talking decades, will the soil eventually foul and having too much collection of salts that aren't collected by the plant structure and allowed to collect into the soil? So that's just some of the aspects. Then finally, some ideas for you. I think that when some of these projects, we got to look at the viability of them as well. And there's some interesting sustainable business concepts here that can be done, because when you show the Hawthorne Mall and that area is all quite expensive land, and it's getting replaced. The big box malls are, but as we know, e-commerce is really taking off, and Amazon's looking for the next place that they can put their distribution warehouses to get us our products. But there's potential offsets that can benefit other corporations to where you can actually get some benefit of this. So have you looked at potential offset? First off, for the LA Regional Water Quality Board, there's Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, has to make sure that the fresh water that they are using is for best beneficial use, and building up a freshwater wall to offset the sea water incursion may not be the best. So perhaps with this, you can offset that and get some points there with them. And then also for wetland offsets and carbon offsets, these forests will be a source of oxygen as well, and will help offset some greenhouse gas. So there's potential benefits there as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Luis. Those are really great questions. So, Professor?
Oh, yes, I took, thank you so much. I took them more like directives for further work and research. I don't have answers for everything. That's why I think that in the next steps, we did sort of say that we would love to have more of these conversations with experts like you and with botanists and others. And there are local organizations as well as Los Angeles-wide organizations and universities and even other teams from the Pando presentations, I think. Yes, the kind of the conversation about non-native versus invasive, that has to be really searched out. Los Angeles had salt marshes before the city took over. There is a salt marsh close to where I live, Baluna wetlands, and so some species exist there, and especially the salt marsh is very much on the kind of the local species that existed. I think most of them are, you know, the most sort of striking thing would be the mature forest trees, which obviously don't exist here yet, like the mangroves or the other species, the tulip tree, and I've kind of listed them there. So these trees, perhaps when the marshes existed where we are, we're not there. I think the climate is kind of changing a little bit now. So one can look at the Sea of Cortez as already an environment that is being studied for mangrove plantations. And Carl Hodges, this scientist, there is already kind of creating these test plots of mangroves and Saliconia. So there are shifts of migrations of these conditions moving slightly north, which we are on the tip of the mangrove belt, let's say, if you look at the world. And so I think, yes, there is a big question, and I don't have the answer for that. So the other part of it, soil. Again, I think you're more the expert. I would love to work with on this. My imagination, in my mind, the sort of the evaporative cycle is the one that is most dangerous for concentrating salinity. We see it in the salt flats in the desert, but in the lush place, I think that is somehow less of a danger. Also, the halophytes absorb salts into their tissues or excrete onto this. This could be harvested. This could be taken away. They are also in some way soil remediation plants. So one would plant a halophytic meadow, and actually the soil would decrease its salinity at the end. So yes, it requires much more depth. I do agree. And Yeah.
Sorry to keep you a little short. I'm just
Yeah, yeah,
keeping an eye on the time, and we have a couple more
Okay.
members of the CSO task force. And I think also some of this stuff is in the Q&A too, so there's plenty of opportunity to expound on that a little bit. I want to thank Luis, and I want to introduce now Chris Ree with Borough Happold Engineering. Chris is a key architect of the LA County Sustainability Plan. Go ahead, Chris.
Thank you so much. What a fantastic project. I have to say, as I was watching it, I was thinking of Olmsted's emerald necklace. It's very evocative of that, and I wonder if this is like perhaps a crystalline necklace. So I'll give that one to you for free. So I just to say some other things that really stood out to me about this presentation. I thought the big box reuse was an incredibly salient point, especially now, given where we are with our current economic conditions, and really thinking about the future of retail, but beyond that, sort of the way that we think about land use in our cities and communities, and how we are using it to meet our own needs as well as serve ecological function. So I think that's maybe wasn't the intent at the start, but even more pertinent today. I want to be additive. I think I agree with some of the earlier comments, but what I wanted to focus on was really thinking about how what is the experience of visiting these places, and how is the community in Torrance interacting with this project? How do you balance sort of the need to provide ecological services and public amenities, noting the broad sort of lack of parks and open space throughout LA County, and thinking particularly about the community in Torrance, which is 35% Asian and Pacific Islanders, and noting cultural differences in the usage of open space. I think the juxtaposition of hardscape and landscape actually is an asset in this case, as hardscape is used in a lot of Asian traditions for gathering, for practicing of Tai Chi and other traditions. So I guess I'm asking about sort of how do people fit into this design, and what are the opportunities for environmental education and other forms of gathering?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We want to make some contact with for example, the Maradona Marsh Preserve, because they are already working with community colleges, and the community colleges use the landscape as an educational tool. So there are field trips and field works and things like that. So I think we could connect to some of that, like on the local level. I think the other people I've searched. I mean, I have to be honest. We have to do a lot more of this, but that's why I think the next part is exactly that local research. There's also societies that do allotment gardening in that part of town, and so there are already groups in place that I think it's all about folklore in some way. The way that we use more natural spaces. It's not really. There's a difference between what we're proposing in a park. So there's a sort of a difference in behavior of different cultures, as you say, and so I think that would actually strengthen the project, to know about even the fairy tales of the ethnicities or the cultures that live in Torrance, which is a very kind of varied group, I think, right? There's Asian communities, there's Mexican communities, so it's a kind of a melting pot, and I wonder if the forest is strong enough as an archetype to absorb and have a sort of a common imaginary, which is sort of almost like a kind of thing that unifies cultures, right? It's always a dark space or a place of kind of magical enchantment. There's danger and enchantment in a sense, but I think those things are part of the project and are important. And so we want to build a prototype which is sightless, but then we want to address a specific locality, and through that refine the actual shape of the thing. Because the shapes, as you can see, are all about sort of channels and spillages, which could be any shape actually, and they could sort of create different spaces. It's a system, the channel and the kind of the prefabricated timber elements that sort of create the walls. So in some way, it's a malleable infrastructure for these spaces and for the kind of uses that might happen there. But so who is the forester has been the question that came up all the time. And you know, we could look at the Maradona Marsh Preserve as a first step, because they do have docents and they do have people coming in from the colleges, and so there's experts, but there's also kind of almost citizens who are interested in doing this. So the kind of the carers are not necessarily professional foresters in the old sense, but they're more sort of citizen foresters, you know, locals basically. So yeah, that is a whole next step that we need to look at.
Yep, that's excellent information, and thanks for those great comments, Chris. I'd like to introduce Katherine Miller, who is the former Chief Sustainability Officer and Campus Facilities Manager for the Conrad and Hilton Foundation. Katherine was responsible for their extraordinary LEED building in Agora Hills.
Hi, thank you very much. And Professor Boburska, that's a very fascinating presentation. And I have to admit that I was not aware of the seawater intrusion issue that is existing currently, not to that level. So the way you've laid this out was extremely interesting for me. I know that we're running out of time, so I had very similar questions to, my previous colleagues have asked. But I'll ask something more about the practical level, which is, the community support for this type of approach, and what you envision that to be, the costs involved in, installation of this type of work, and then again, the upkeep and maintenance. And I think you talked about it just a little bit previously, who owns it? Who's going to provide the maintenance, ongoing maintenance over time? And then, secondly, I wanted to, just comment about the adaptive reuse of box stores, the big box stores, as you've indicated. I think that's extremely creative ideas. But again, from a practicality standpoint, the cost to, reconstruct those, I wondered what your thinking was around that and how that would be funded.
So thank you for the question. Yes, some of the prototypes are kind of humongous in scale. The finest grain of the buildable prototype is the Saltwater Garden, which we're sort of thinking could be the one that we would want to move with. So the other ones are, you're right, bigger projects, the big box. But I think, it could be, the kind of the offsets to, for example, reusing some of the ones that are already in ruin. It could be a strategy for reusing the fabric of the city, even if it's by a company, let's say, I don't know, some distribution center, Amazon, that wants to take over half of the Hawthorne Plaza, but the rest could be something that they might need. they might need in order to, sort of offset whatever they're doing, and the city might need to create a park space in a zone that is really hard throughout Hawthorne Boulevard. So I think negotiation with bigger partners for the larger projects is key, and it could be of benefit to them. For the smaller projects, the more sort of roots up, community-based projects like the Saltwater Gardens, I think we would like to maybe work with the city, the Department of Public Works, the West Coast Basin Barrier Project, people who are already, making new wells as we speak, because the system is old, and to kind of work with them to create pavilions in the parks that exist already would be a benefit to the city, but also part of the solution that they are spending money on and spending precious fresh water on. So I think it's a negotiation and a kind of a presentation of a benefit to the other partners. And there are partners of different levels. So yes, from government all the way down to the allotment society, allotment garden society. We need both.
Thank you. That's really fantastic. And thanks for that really great comment, Katherine. And now it's time for public Q&A, but we're right at the end of our time. So I'd like to introduce Adam Ewens, who is the curator of Pando Days, and he is going to moderate and pick one or two of the questions that are in the chat box. And Adam, take it away.
Thank you, Victory. Wow, only one or two. There's quite a few good ones here.
I'm sorry. Unless Eugene wants to take over the hosting, I have to leave soon. So I think that so maybe the professor wants to comment on some of those other ones at another date. But yeah, I agree. There's some great questions there.
I know that, I love in the project, Berenica, that you're working with nature and not against nature. And in our talks, you spoke about how you're an architect who doesn't have a client, and then you thought about it and you said, well, my client is actually nature. So one of the questions there, have you considered vector issues such as mosquitoes in your project and how to address them?
Mosquitoes, animals, insects, other things that will move into the marsh and the swamp. Yes, we have not considered them yet, but I think the forest is a place for wild things and for humans and for plants, right? So there is that. Mosquitoes. So these are insects that are not thought of as beneficial, and we have a kind of a judgment about butterflies and versus mosquitoes. I don't know. I think nature is messy, and the swamp is messy, and the forest is a place full of things. So I would say it's more of an inclusive thinking about nature.
Would can you predict the amount of seawater that will be diverted? And if there's like an infinite supply of seawater, won't it just keep on coming, or will it change the balance of things as you pump it out?
No. So this is a sort of we imagine a steady supply that gets diverted. In the 50s, when the barrier was first made, it advanced at a huge rate of, I forget the numbers exactly, but it was frightening, and it got stopped by the barrier, and some of it, obviously, the plume went through, but it's a steady supply of water. And if anything, the rate will increase. And so the gardens, the gardens and the parks and the forests might have to respond to that in a way that they absorb it, but also release it, but also release the moisture into the soil, So there's absorption going on and release, as in forests. This is a source of water that is flowing and that we will have to take on all the time, right? So it's not something that you stop after a while. The forest has to be ready and we keep watering the gardens, right? So it's definitely a flow, and yeah, it's a continuous flow.
Thank you, Berenica. I think I should give it back to Eugene as we're past the hour mark.
I'll just wrap up really quick and thank the professor so much for this really fascinating presentation. For me, the idea of a kind of a future cuisine that is more salt focused and having us kind of adapt to that as part of our evolution into a new normal is kind of brilliant thinking, and I like that a lot. And I was not at all surprised to find out that you live near the Bologna wetlands, since this isn't an issue where Woodbury University is. And so how fantastic is it that your students who maybe they live in the Burbank area, they wouldn't, like many of us, they wouldn't really be aware of what's happening near the coasts, because their own drinking water has different issues than the drinking water near where you are. And so it's fantastic. It's almost like a cross-cultural thing in water culture that you are bringing to Woodbury University and the students there, the information from your own microclimate there. So and with that, I am passing along to Eugene. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, and thank you, Vickery, for hosting this event. Many thanks to Berenica and the entire Woodbury University team for creating such a fascinating initiative. Everyone, please remember you can see all of the Woodbury presentation materials on our website, pandopopulous.com. A recording of today's presentation will be up by tomorrow night. Many thanks to the members of the CSO task force who responded today: Mark Spears, Luis Navarro, Chris Ree, and Katherine Miller. Many thanks to the Pando Days curator, Adam Ewens, festival producer, Shelley Goldstein, producer, Betsy Hunter, and presentation consultant, Judith Parker. Pando Days was conceived with the help of the CSO Strategic Task Force and made possible by the Conrad N. Hilton Foundation, Second Home, the Mary Knowles Sisters, and many others. Make sure to join us next Tuesday at 1 o'clock for the premiere presentation by Caltech of a new initiative coming through their sustainability program called Innovation Engine for Sustainable Development. You can get a preview of it on our website by tomorrow night. Thank you again, and have a great afternoon.